You think the 1950s was all chrome diners and meatloaf under glass. It wasn't, not in my house. In my house, the 1950s was a near-empty cupboard and a mother counting coins on the oilcloth before she decided what we'd eat. The shiny part of that decade was something other people had. We ate around the edges of it. But here's the truth I came to learn. There were stretches when I fed myself and one other person for under $3 a week, and we did not go hungry, and we did not eat sad food. We ate well. We ate warm. I learned that at a kitchen table in the hills of eastern Kentucky from a grandmother who never once said the word broke out loud because she didn't have to. You could read it in how slowly she stirred a pot. And I'm going to give you everything she gave me. The beans, the gravies, the breakfast that cost almost nothing, the one-pot meal you can make tonight if your hands hurt and your back is tired. But I'm holding one meal back until the very end. It comes from a book published in 1942, written by a woman who taught starving Americans how to eat like they still had dignity. It cost pennies. It saved me more than once, and almost nobody under 60 has ever heard of it. So if you live alone, or it's just two of you now, and the money runs thin before the month runs out, pull your chair in close. This is for you. Let me start where the smell starts. Because the first thing I remember about being poor isn't hunger. It's cornmeal. My grandmother kept a sack of yellow cornmeal that seemed to never empty, and every cold morning she made mush. Just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, stirred slow over low heat until it thickened into something between porridge and pudding. That was it. That was breakfast. A nickel's worth of meal fed three of us, and it sat in your stomach like a warm stone all the way to noon. But she did a thing with it that I have never seen in a single modern cookbook. Whatever mush we didn't eat, she poured into a bread pan and set it in the cold pantry overnight. By morning, it had set up firm as a brick. She'd slice it, fry the slices in a little grease until the edges went gold and crisp, and pour a thread of molasses over the top. 2 meals out of one pot, the same cornmeal, the same nickel, but now it tasted like a treat. That was the first lesson, and it ran underneath everything else she taught me. You cook once. You eat twice. You never let a warm pot become cold waste. I didn't understand back then why we lived that way while the radio sang about prosperity. I was a boy. I just thought that was food. It took me years to understand that what we ate wasn't backward or shameful. It was knowledge. Real, hard-won knowledge that people had carried through the Depression a decade before and through the war after it, and were quietly passing down at kitchen tables while the rest of the country was being taught to forget it. Because that's what was happening, even if I couldn't see it yet. In those same 1950s years, the bright new magazines were filling up with cake mixes and canned everything and frozen dinners on little trays. The message was loud and cheerful. Cooking from scratch was for people who couldn't afford better. Convenience was the future. And the slow, cheap, deeply nourishing meals my grandmother made were being painted as poverty itself, something to be ashamed of, something to leave behind the minute you had a few dollars. I believed that for a long time. I was ashamed of those meals. When I grew up and money got tight in my own life, my first instinct was to hide what I was eating. I'll tell you about that. But first I need to tell you about the beans, because the beans are the foundation, and you can't understand any of the rest without them. My grandmother kept a bean pot going almost like a fire you never let die. Dried pinto beans soaked overnight in plain water, then simmered all day with a piece of fatback or a ham bone she'd been saving, an onion, and not much else. A pound of dried beans cost almost nothing then, and it still costs little. Now, a $1 bag of dried pintos will give you around 13 cups cooked. That's serving after serving after serving from a single dollar. And here are the numbers nobody told me when I was young and ashamed. A cup of cooked pinto beans gives you around 15 grams of protein and 15 grams of fiber. Land-grant extension nutrition programs have been saying it plainly for decades. Beans deliver protein at a fraction of the cost of meat, with fiber and iron meat doesn't even carry. That bowl I was embarrassed to admit I ate was, by the actual science, one of the most complete and honest meals on the table. She served those beans over cornbread, and that's the part I want you to really hear. The beans were cheap, but the cornbread is what made it a meal that filled a working man. Cornbread back then was cornmeal, a little fat, salt, and either buttermilk or just water if the milk was gone. You bake it in a hot greased skillet. It costs pennies. And when you crumble hot cornbread into a bowl of bean soup and let it soak up the broth, you have something that has fed poor Americans north and south for 200 years and never once failed them. But the real trick, the part that separates somebody who's just poor from somebody who knows how to be poor, was the pot liquor. That's the thick, dark, salty broth left in the bottom of the bean pot. My grandmother would never, ever pour it out. She called it the best part, and she was right. It's where the minerals and the flavor and the dissolved goodness all settle. We'd sop it up with bread, or she'd save it and start the next pot of soup with it. Nothing left, nothing wasted. Therefore, the beans were never just beans. Day 1, beans and cornbread. Day 2, the leftover beans got mashed and fried into a thick patty, crisp on the outside. Day 3, what was left went into a pot with water. The saved pot liquor, a chopped potato, and whatever else was around, and became soup. 1 pound of beans, 3 different meals, and not one of them tasted like the day before. Now let me take you forward out of that warm kitchen to the year it stopped being a story about my grandmother and started being a story about me. I was a grown man with my own rent to pay, and I had a stretch where I had $3 to my name and 4 days until any more was coming. I remember standing in front of my own cupboard, and it was nearly bare. A little flour, some cornmeal, half an onion going soft, a few eggs, and I felt that old shame rise up in me, hot in my face, because here I was supposedly past all that, and I was right back at the bottom. But my hands already knew what to do, even when my pride didn't want to admit it. And the meal that carried me through those 4 days cost almost nothing, and is something I bet most people have completely forgotten. It's milk gravy on bread. Some folks called it poor man's gravy, or sawmill gravy without the sausage. Here's how it goes. You put a spoonful of fat in a pan grease, butter, drippings, whatever you've got. You stir in an equal spoonful of flour and let it cook a minute until it smells nutty. Then you pour in milk, a little at a time, stirring the whole while until it thickens into a creamy gravy. Salt, and all the black pepper you can stand. You pour that over torn up bread or toast or a split biscuit. That's the meal, flour, fat, milk. Maybe 10 cents worth. And it is rich and hot, and it fills you up like something far more expensive. If I had an onion, I'd slice it thin and brown it in the fat first, and that turned the whole thing into onion gravy, which tasted like a meal somebody loved you enough to make. Down south, they made a version with canned tomatoes or even ketchup stirred into that same flour and fat base, poured over biscuits. Tomato gravy, Appalachian families lived on it. It cost almost nothing, and it broke up the sameness, and breaking up the sameness is half of surviving a lean stretch with your spirit intact. That was the thing I learned standing at my own bare cupboard. Being broke isn't only about calories. It's about the slow grind of eating the same dull thing until you stop wanting to eat at all. The old poor man cooks knew that. They weren't just keeping you alive. They were keeping you interested in being alive. A thread of molasses on fried mush, browned onions in the gravy. These weren't luxuries. They were survival, dressed up just enough to keep your dignity breathing. But I want to be honest with you about something, because this is a confession, not a cooking show. There were nights I skipped eating entirely because I was too tired and too low to stand at a stove. And if you live alone right now, I think you know exactly the feeling I mean. So let me talk to you directly, you the one cooking for just yourself or for the two of you, and finding that some days it's just too heavy to face. Maybe your knees don't want to hold you at the counter. Maybe your hands don't grip the knife the way they used to. Maybe the worst part isn't even the money, it's the loneliness of making a whole meal for one person at an empty table. I have stood in that exact spot, so let me give you the way through it, the way I found it. You make one pot one time when you do have a little energy, and you let that pot feed you for most of a week. And the meal I lean on for this needs almost no knife work and barely any standing. It's a pot of split pea soup, and it is about the most forgiving thing you can make. You take a 1-pound bag of dried split peas under $2, and they need no soaking at all, which beans do. You rinse them. You put them in your biggest pot with about 8 cups of water. If you have a ham bone or a smoked turkey leg or even a couple of cheap bouillon cubes, in it goes. Now here's the part that saves your hands. You don't have to finely chop anything. Quarter an onion in big rough pieces. Throw in a couple of carrots snapped into chunks, or don't if cutting is too much that day. Bring it to a boil, then turn it low, put the lid on, and walk away. Go sit down. Rest. An hour and a half later, those split peas have completely fallen apart on their own into a thick, golden, creamy soup. You don't blend it. You don't fuss with it. The peas do all the work while you're off your feet. And split peas, like their cousins the beans, are loaded with protein and fiber. Around 16 grams of protein in a cooked cup. That one lazy pot gives you 4, 5, even 6 bowls. You eat one tonight, you put the rest in the refrigerator. And every day that week, when you're too tired to cook, there's a hot, hearty, real meal waiting that costs you under 50 cents a bowl and asks nothing of you but to warm it back up. It reheats better than it started, honestly. The flavor deepens. And when the soup starts running low, you stretch it the old way, you add a little water and a handful of rice or some torn bread, and it becomes a whole new meal again. One pot, one tired evening of effort, a week of not going hungry and not going broke. That is the gift the old cooks left for exactly the situation so many of us are in now. Therefore, I want to ask you to do something. The next time you have a halfway decent day, an hour, where your body feels willing, that's the day you cook the big pot. Not when you're starving and depleted. You cook from your strength and you eat from your storage. And that single shift in timing is the difference between eating well alone and slowly giving up on feeding yourself at all. I learned it the hard way. I'm handing it to you so you don't have to. Everything I've shared with you in this video, and a great deal more that I couldn't fit here, is gathered in full in my book, Grandma's Penny Table. It's a complete field guide to these lost kitchen skills, written for the person cooking alone, or for 2 on a thin budget, with every recipe laid out simply, and every trick explained. The way my grandmother explained things to me, without shame, without fuss, just the honest knowing. You can find it at the link in the description over at lost-grandma-foods.com, and it's the closest thing I know to sitting down at that Kentucky table with me. If this video spoke to you, that book was written for exactly you. Now, I've given you a lot. The mush and the molasses, the beans and the pot liquor, the poor man's gravy, the lazy pot of split pea soup. And if you stopped right here, you'd have enough to eat well on almost nothing for a long time. But I told you at the start that I was holding one meal back, the one that changed everything for me. And to tell you about it right, I have to tell you about the lowest night I ever had, because that's the night I learned it. It was deep winter. I had lost work. The cupboard wasn't nearly bare. This time it was bare. A heel of stale bread gone hard, half an onion, a bit of fat, salt, water from the tap. That was the entire inventory of my kitchen, and I remember standing there feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me, because for the first time I genuinely did not see a meal in it. I saw garbage. I saw the end of the line, and I sat down at the table with my head in my hands, and I thought about my grandmother, and I thought about a thing she used to say when the food got down to almost nothing. She'd say, "As long as there's bread and an onion in this house, there's supper." I never knew what she meant. Stale bread and an onion isn't supper. It's what's left after supper is gone. But she knew something I didn't, and it sent me that very night digging through an old box of books I'd carried around for years and never really read. In it was a cookbook from 1942, written during the war by a woman named M.F.K. Fisher. The book was called How to Cook a Wolf, the wolf being hunger, the wolf at the door. She wrote it for Americans facing rationing and empty shelves. And she wrote it not as a sad survival manual, but as a kind of defiant celebration of eating well when you have nearly nothing. And in that book, she defended a dish that most people had already thrown away as too poor, too peasant, too embarrassing to admit you ate. A dish that goes back hundreds of years in the kitchens of poor people across France and Italy and beyond. And that came over to America in immigrant tenements and got quietly buried as those families clawed their way up and out and were taught to be ashamed of where they came from. It's called a panade, and it is at its heart a soup made of stale bread and onions. Exactly what my grandmother said was always enough for supper. Here is how you make it, and I want you to really listen, because this turned the worst night of my life into a hot meal that I have never forgotten the taste of. You take that stale, hard bread, the staler the better, because stale bread drinks up flavor in a way fresh bread can't. You tear it into chunks. You take your onion and you slice it, and you cook it slow and low in your bit of fat until it turns soft and sweet and golden. Don't rush it. That slow-cooked onion is the entire soul of the dish, and it costs you nothing but a little patience. Then you add the torn bread right into the pot with the onions, and you pour in water, just plain water, if that's all you have, though broth or that saved bean pot liquor makes it richer enough to cover everything. You salt it. You add pepper or a leaf of something, a clove of garlic if you've got one, and then you let it simmer gently while the bread completely dissolves into the broth and the whole thing turns thick and soft and silky, almost like a savory pudding. If you have even a scrap of cheese, you grate it in at the end, and it melts through and turns plain bread and water into something that tastes, I swear to you, like it belongs in a restaurant. That night I had no cheese. I had stale bread, half an onion, fat, salt, and water, and I made that panade, and I sat down alone at my table, and I ate the best, most comforting bowl of food I had had in months. It was hot. It was thick. It filled me completely. It cost me, in real terms, almost nothing pennies, the kind of leftovers most people scrape into the trash without a second thought. And I sat there and I cried, honestly, because I finally understood what my grandmother had been telling me my whole life. Bread and an onion really is supper. It always was. The knowledge to turn nearly nothing into a real, dignified, satisfying meal that was the inheritance, not money. The knowing, that's the meal I held back, because that's the meal that changed me. After that night, I was never afraid of an empty cupboard the same way again. I knew that as long as I had something starchy and something from the onion family and a little fat and some salt, I could make supper, real supper. And no run of bad luck could take that knowing away from me, because it lived in my hands, not in my wallet. M.F.K. Fisher knew it in 1942. The poor families who carried that panade across an ocean knew it. My grandmother in the Kentucky hills knew it. And here's the part that still makes me angry now that we're far enough in that I'll say it plainly. That knowledge didn't disappear by accident. It was sold out from under us. In the years after the war, there was a great deal of money to be made in convincing Americans that cooking from scratch was a burden and a shame. Every box of mix, every can, every frozen tray on a little aluminum dish came wrapped in the same quiet message: you don't need to know how to do this anymore. Let us do it for you. And a meal like panade that costs pennies and needs no factory at all was exactly the kind of knowledge that made you a poor customer. A person who can make supper from bread and an onion doesn't need much from the grocery aisle. So that person had to be made to feel backward. Old-fashioned, pitiful, it worked. It worked so well that 2 generations grew up genuinely not knowing how to feed themselves on a thin budget, and convinced that being unable to was somehow a sign of having moved up in the world. We were taught to mistake dependence for progress. We traded a skill that could never be taken from us for a lifetime of being someone's customer. And the people it hit hardest are the very ones watching me right now, folks on a fixed income, doing the math at the end of the month, who were promised all their lives that convenience was the same as comfort and found out far too late that it wasn't. But here's what they didn't count on. The knowledge didn't die. It just went quiet. It survived in old cookbooks like Fisher's, in church and community recipe collections, in the memories of people who lived it, and at kitchen tables where a grandmother told a boy that bread and an onion was always enough. And every time one of us makes that pot of beans, or that milk gravy, or that panade, and then teaches it to somebody else, we take a little piece of ourselves back. We stop being only a customer. We become someone who can feed himself again, no matter how thin the times get. That's the whole thing I wanted to give you. Not just recipes, the knowing. The cornmeal mush you cook once and fry twice. The pound of beans that becomes 3 different suppers and never wastes its pot liquor. The poor man's gravy that turns flour and milk into a feast. The lazy split pea soup that feeds you all week when your body is tired and your table is empty. And the panade bread and an onion and water and salt that proves to you on your very worst night that you are not out of options and you are not out of dignity. If you take one thing from an old man talking too long at his kitchen table, let it be this. You are not poor in the way they wanted you to feel poor. You come from people who could make a warm, filling, honest meal out of what others threw away, and that skill is still yours the moment you decide to pick it back up. You are the kind of person who refuses to waste, who feeds himself well, no matter how thin the money gets, and who knows that there is no shame, none in a bowl of beans and cornbread. There's only the quiet pride of somebody who never forgot how. So now I want to hear from you, and I mean this. Which one of these meals did you grow up on? Was it the fried mush with molasses? The tomato gravy over biscuits? The pot of beans that fed the whole family for days? Or is there one I didn't name, one from your own hard times that I need to know about? Tell me in the comments. Write it down for the rest of us, because somebody reading is going to need exactly the meal you remember. And tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing where these old kitchens still live. Don't just pass through here quietly. Subscribe and stand with the rest of us who are keeping these survival meals alive, because every one of us who remembers is one less meal lost for good. We're a table, not a channel, and there's always a chair open. And next time, I'm going to tell you about the dessert poor families made with no eggs, no milk, and no butter or cake that came out of the First World War, that my grandmother baked when there was nothing sweet left in the house. And that tasted, I promise you, like somebody still believed tomorrow was worth celebrating. Stay close. I'll save you a piece.